I welcome all the participants of this lecture. This is the fourth lecture of this course. And the outline of this lecture will be on the line of the biodiversity, what is biodiversity and its elements and the scales, and why the need of biodiversity assessments, role of geoinformatics in biodiversity studies, and what are the different geoinformatics approaches and application in various biodiversity assessment studies, and some examples on the application of machine learning and the conclusion. So first we will see what is the biodiversity and what are the different parameters. So if you see holistically, the biodiversity is the sum of all the biotic variation from the gene to ecosystem level. So it comprises the variety of life and its process, the variety of living organisms, and the genetic differences among them, and the community ecosystem variations, and the overall ecological process that keeps them the functioning in a ecosystem. So it includes the number of species, the communities, and the ecosystem diversity over a landscape. And it can be depicted like this from the genetic level. If you see the composition, structure, and functional aspects of the biodiversity, then the genes are the basic building blocks. Then the species, if you see the compositional aspect, the species, then the community, then the whole ecoregion in which all these community and the species exist. In the structural terms, then the genetic structure, the population structure, what are the population sizes, and the habitat structure, the physiognomy of any forest or any vegetation types, how it appears, and the heterogeneity over the landscape, how the different these populations or the community distributed over the landscape. And in the functional parts, these are the various genetic processes that acts at the genetic level. Then the demographic processes, the population and the various interaction that occurs between the species and the community, and the overall ecological processes, the interaction among the individuals, the communities, and also the flow of the nutrients or the energy, the food chain. All these comes under the functional aspect. So why the need of biodiversity assessment? Because the biodiversity supports the habitats for all the species by creating different kinds of environment in which the species can exist. So in any kind of association, it makes the different kind of environment, and so the resulting in the different kind of ecosystems of different sizes, as well as the corridor of the dispersal and the movement of the species. So it is also the fundamental for the provision of ecosystem services, because all the ecosystem services that flow are basically related to the biodiversity component. So this is another importance of the biodiversity. So all the ecosystem services that we receive from the nature, so biodiversity that is involved in the most or all the components. So the state of the biodiversity, the health of the biodiversity, that reflects the condition of any ecosystem, the functioning of the ecosystem. So if the biodiversity is in the good state, then the health of the ecosystem is also related to that. And if you see the international forums, for example, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, this conservation of biodiversity has been put on the highest priority. So you can see the lots of the forums and the convention are related to the biodiversity, and every year we celebrate the Biological Diversity Day, and the United Nations declared that the 2021 to 2020 as a decade of the biodiversity. So it is also given the highest priority through the international forums. So if you see in the recent trends, the rapid loss of biodiversity in the industrialized area in the era, it basically due to the degradation of the habitats or the invasion, and also the global change impacts, because all the ecosystem or they are basically connected with each other, and the global change have lots of impact on the global biodiversity. So understanding the patterns of structure, its function, and also the various causes of its depletion is very important for the biodiversity conservation. So if you see the different aspect of the biodiversity conservation and also the components of biodiversity, we can divide into the natural resources, that is basically the protected the area, the connectivity among the ecosystems or in the landscape, and how the rare ecosystem are existed there, and what is the habitat of these species, and what are the benefits that arises from the biodiversity. Basically the recreational activities and the public health, that the medicinal and aromatic plants that we receive from the biodiversity, and also the genetic diversity, all the food plants that we are depends on, and what are the drivers of the changes, because this is very important to understand in the era of this climate change and the rapid depletion of the biodiversity. What are the different the drivers of the changes? That is very important to understand to assess the biodiversity patterns in any area. So because if you need to assess the biodiversity, we need to assess some components or some parameters based on which we can say that the status and what will be the impacts of different kind of patterns on the biodiversity. So some that parameters I listed here. For example, the number of species. What is the number of species? The assemblage of species and the distribution, their distribution pattern in any area, and the size of the population or the community over the landscape or in any ecosystem, and what are the trends or the status of different species, the indicator species which contributes maximum to any ecosystem, and what are the forest cover, because this is the one of the important criteria based on which we can assess the status of the biodiversity, and it also forms the basic data on which we can do various the analysis. And the one major thing is the degree of the fragmentation, how the landscape is fragmented in terms of the habitat of a particular species, and what is the percentage of each ecosystem, because it takes a lot of time to convert from one the particular land cover type to another. So how much percentage of each ecosystem is converted over the period of time, and what is the rate of its changes. So this parameter also contribute to the assessment of biodiversity, and the status and trend of each vegetation type or the habitat within each ecosystem. So many species, they are adapted to a certain kind of environmental condition or a vegetation in which they can only exist on that. So what is the trend and status of a particular vegetation type, that is also important in the biodiversity studies. And the threatened species, because there is an increasing trend in the number of threatened species over the period of time, and what are the species, and how much the suitable habitat that species exist for that species in a particular landscape, based on which we can do the conservation prioritization of the area. And what are the stresses, the anthropogenic stresses, because in the landscape level studies we cannot deny the impact of the human disturbances or the other stresses on the biodiversity. So this is the another component or the parameter that is useful for the biodiversity assessment. So based on all these parameters, we can assess or synthesize the impact or the patterns of the biodiversity over a particular area. So then we can see what are the importance of the geoinformatics. So if you see, according to the convention, the UN Convention on the Biological Diversity, by 2050 all the biodiversity is valued, conserved, or the restored by mainstreaming ecosystem services and delivering benefit to the people. So this is the one of the theme of the convention on the biodiversity, and the group of Earth observation on biodiversity observation network, that is called the GEO1, that is dedicatedly working on the to derive the parameters or the important parameters, what are the changes over the period of time, and to support the scientists and the policymakers. So the GeoBond developed essential biodiversity variables that are the EBVs, which are defined by the derived measurement required to study, report, and manage the biodiversity value. So these are applicable or the modeled globally, and it should ideally capitalize from the integrating remote sensing. So remote sensing is an important aspect to derive the essential biodiversity variables. So in little detail, we can see the different what are different essential biodiversity variable classes, from the genetic composition to the species population, species traits, community composition, ecosystem function, and the ecosystem structure level. In this, we can measure the most of the traits or the biodiversity variable candidates through the remote sensing or the involving remote sensing partly or completely. And here you can see how we can do a baseline study through the in situ monitoring, and you can apply the remote sensing on that, and you can derive the essential biodiversity variables for the species trait, population, genetic composition, through which we can develop the indicators of the biodiversity changes or the ecosystem services over the area, and finally we can contribute to the policy making and the conservation aspect of the species. So these are the basic the parameters which are useful for the in the remote sensing point of view, which can be derived globally as a standard, and it can be used for developing the conservation studies as well as the management. So how we can integrate the different data for assessing the biological diversity or the patterns. So through the remote sensing, because of the synoptic views, we can cover the larger area through the remote sensing, and we can assess the vegetation cover, vegetation type, and community, their assemblages, and the extent over the area. And with the inputs from the supporting data like the ground truth point or the inventory data or the old records, the flora, herbarium, because these are also important. They have some mentions about the local area or the locations of a particular species. Then the socio-economic data, and the boundaries, the administrative different boundaries, the disturbances, the impacts of the human beings, and the climate, the canopy height through the different the instruments we measure, and the terrain characteristics. That are the elevation and the patterns of the slope and aspect. And based on these parameters and integrating this with the various GIS models, we can derive the stocks on such as the biomass, carbon, timber, or the various foliar characteristics of the species, and what are the different gregarious formations over the landscape, and we can derive the biological richness, the maps, the patterns, and what are the fragmentation, the ecosystem health and the risk, and it can be used in the environmental impact assessment studies, and the prioritization of the area for the conservation, the suitability of the habitat suitability of any species, the distribution model, and the developing the information system. So holistically, these three parameters, the remote sensing, and the GPS or the ground support data, and the GIS, it integrates all that information, and it generates the products which are useful for the assessing the biodiversity. So one thing is important to mention, that what are the different remote sensing resolutions, satellite and the resolution, the useful for the assessment of the biodiversity. So the coarse resolution data, basically more than 60 meter spatial resolution up to 500 meter, these are basically important for the ecosystem level assessment of the area, and what are the different biogeochemical interactions in a landscape. And if you see the moderate resolution category, the nearly 30 meter resolution data, we can derive the habitat condition and the health of that habitat, and also we can measure or the assess or the map the forest types. And with slightly high resolution data, 1 to 5 meter that resolution data, we can do the analysis at the community level, the boundaries of the community, and what are the mixing patterns in a particular landscape, and how the communities are distributed. And the recent trends are the use of the very high resolution data, that is near to the 1 meter or the less than 1 meter data derived from various satellites as well as the UAVs. And these are very useful on the population level inventory, and we can assess the canopy or the population of the forest inside the forest. And if you see the other data category, that is basically the laser-borne or the hyperspectral data, these are very useful in the deriving the 3D model of the forest, and also the foliar characteristics. For example, if you have the hyperspectral data with more than 200 bands and with very narrow bandwidth, then we can derive the various nutrients status on the canopy of the forest. So this is the example of the usefulness of the different remote sensing resolutions for the assessing the various biodiversity parameters at different levels from the canopy to the ecosystem. So we will first come to the forest cover, because this is the most important, the base layer on which we can work for the assessment of various criteria or the parameters for the biodiversity. So as per the classification of the Forest Survey of India, the forest patch with more than 1 hectare and the canopy with 10%, more than 10% canopy cover, we consider it as a forest. So for the assessment of the forest cover is basically done based on the NDVI thresholding, on basis of which we can remove we can classify the non-forest and non-forest area, and we do the classification. We remove the area with less than 1 hectare, that is not we characterize as a forest class. And based on the reference data from the ground data, we do on-screen image, the interpretation of the image. Then we classify it different the density and the canopy cover classes of the forest. And based on the time series data, we can also do the change detection over the land, the cover classes and the total forest area over the landscape. So this is the one example of the forest cover of India as per the recent assessment cycle of Forest Survey of India. If you see for the biodiversity conservation perspective, then we need to have the different the criteria of the different category of forest, how much area is under the dense forest, moderate forest, or the open forest category, because the classes with higher density or the higher canopy cover are considered the ecologically sound condition, and the area with the less canopy cover or the open area, they are ecologically sensitive, because they are very prone to the changes. So if you see the different the canopy cover classes in the real conditions, the continuous or the dense forest are obviously the very good for the rich biodiversity in any area. And these are the example of the same forest with different classes, and this is the isolated patch, a dense patch, but it is isolated. So the value for the biodiversity will be more in a continuous and dense patch as compared to the isolated patch. So based on the forest cover that assessment, we can also assess what are the distribution of the patches and the number of patches, the size of the patches in a landscape. And the another that class is the degraded. So same species in another state where you can see the human encroachment and the lobed condition of the canopy, and also the very sparsely distributed individual of that forest tree. And this is the another very disturbed condition, that is the scrub class of the same forest. So with the biodiversity point of view, we can compare the status of the health of the forest based on the canopy cover also. So this is the one of the important the example how the canopy cover or the classes of the forest can be used in the biodiversity assessment. So this is one of the classic example. So how the diversity is distributed with respect to the forest cover. So this is the global forest cover as per the USGS, and I will highlight the part in the Indian and Indo-Malayan region. So if you see the distribution of the global biodiversity hotspot, that is the area with very high diversity of the species as well as the endemism. So you can see we have 4 global biodiversity hotspots in this part, that is the Himalaya, Indo-Burma, Sundaland and the Western Ghats. And in terms of the forest cover, you can see the Himalayan region, the Western Ghats and the Andaman, that part, and the northeastern region. They are very rich in the forest cover and the density of the forest. So they are, in this way we can link the biodiversity and the richness with the forest cover classes also. So the monitoring the temporal changes in any landscape is another important aspect in biodiversity assessment. So if you see the key drivers of the species decline in any area, as per the recent the assessment, the habitat degradation that comes under the most important parameter which contributes to the species decline in any area, and followed by the exploitation and the invasive species, disease, pollution and the climate change. These are the well described and well discussed drivers of the species decline all over the world. And in a small area, in small area we can do the exercise on the on-screen visualization, how with different time of the images, with time series images, we can assess the gap area, how the forest gaps are increased, and we can assess the changes and how much area is converted from the forest area to the non-forest area. And if you see the larger landscape, so the various the GIS softwares or the remote sensing are very useful in assessing the changes, temporal changes over the larger landscape. And here in the 3 time series data set, we can see how the forest is converted or the changes from in last 30 years of the period, and also from one class to the another class. So here you can see the reduction in the forest area and the increasing in the agriculture and the habitation area. So the agriculture and habitation part will contribute towards the fragmentation and the disturbance index over a landscape. So this is the example of only the forest cover, how it is reduced from 1976 to 2011. So you can see the patch that are distributed over the landscape. So based on the time series data analysis, we can detect the changes over the landscape. And if you see the countrywide exercise, so from 1930s to 2013, you can see the very sharp decline in the forest cover over the Himalayan region, northeast area, the central Indian, and also some parts of the Western Ghat also. How the dense forests are converted to the open forest. And this is the one example of the landscape this is the Rajaji National Park area, this is the Hardwar region, and this is the Corbett National Park. So as a landscape level study, because this area is dominated or the represented by large mammals, that this is called the tiger landscape also. So basically how the forest patches or the forest cover is connected over the landscape. So you can see here there is no the functional corridor that is existing in this part because of the linear infrastructure development and also the encroachment of the habitat and the conversion of the forest into the agriculture area. So we will come later on this example also. So if you see in the landscape level from a wildlife perspective, the landscape is a heterogeneous distribution of the habitat. So how the habitat is distributed over the landscape, and in a ecological perspective, you will see the landscape as the heterogeneous the distribution of the mosaic of the patches over the landscape, over the area that we call as a landscape. So there are many important landscape elements which we consider in the biodiversity assessment. For example, the patches that is the homogeneous area in the landscape, how the patches are distributed and the numbers, their shape and the location in the landscape, how they are distributed, the edges and the boundaries, because the patches will have different the area in terms of the edges and the boundary. So how the shape of the patch is there, and the another that important element is the corridor and the connectivity. So what are the different pathway of the dispersion of the species, and what are the important the barriers on that landscape which blocks the distribution or the movement of the species, and how these patches are distributed over the landscape and how much fragmentation is there. So there are various GIS based software packages available to analyze the landscape, but the basic requirement for this analysis is the forest cover and the density, and that map that we earlier discussed, that is the basis requirement for the landscape analysis. So we will discuss little about the different metrics that we derive from the landscape analysis. So one is the area matrix. So here you can see the value of the matrix also. So you can focus on the green area on each these boxes. So in that way you can interpret these metrics. So in this case, in the case of the area matrix, the first box represents the high value, and the last box is that represents the low value of the area matrix, because you can see the distribution of the patches in that area. So the total area is larger as compared to the last this example. Similarly, in case of the age matrix, the total or the relative age. So if the patches are the smaller and they are distributed all over the landscape, then the edge that is exist on that area will be more as compared to the larger patch. So this is in the edge matrix, and how the shape, the perimeter to area ratio. So in this case of this example, you will find the larger the perimeter as compared to the area that actually exists for as a habitat for a species as compared to this example, because here you can see the green area is larger, and also if you see the perimeter, that is less as compared to the first example. And the important aspect is how the core area exists in any landscape. Core area, that is the interior part of any habitat, and it can be defined based on the phenomena of the consideration. And we define some that area surrounding a particular core, which can be of the several meter to the kilometer range, and this is basically we call as a buffer area. So how much the core area beyond the buffer that exist in a landscape, that is an important parameter in a landscape level study. So in this case, we have very high the core area as compared to this image. Then the criteria of the matrix that includes the patch matrix. So how the patch, the number of patches distributed in an area. So in this case, you can see the more number of patches are there. So patch matrix will be the higher as compared to this last example. So what is the neighborhood among the patches? So how the habitat patches are distributed over the landscape, and the distance between those patches is also an important criteria, because the nearness of these patches will be the important for the dispersal of the species. And another important is the CNN index. In case of the vegetation study or the vegetation inventory, based on the species, we assess the CNN, the diversity indices. And in case of the landscape, because in this case we consider an individual patch as a unit, so how the individual patch and the number of the different the patches and the class that are distributed over the landscape, that we consider in the landscape level analysis. And in the CNN diversity, we can see this box have the higher CNN diversity as compared to the last box, because in this case we can find the homogeneous distribution of different patches as compared to this example. And another example that we derive from the landscape analysis is the contagion and the juxtaposition. So how these patches are intermixed with each other, and how they are the distance between the similar kind of patches with each other. So here you can see the high matrix value, because you can see the patch are distributed all over the area, and in this case there is more distance between the similar kind of patches. So based on this analysis, the landscape matrix, we assess the landscape fragmentation over the area. And in the recent decades, you will find lots of studies are focused on quantifying the fragmentation of the habitats over the area. And because this fragmentation is largely associated with the extinction risk of the species, especially the terrestrial mammals, and also due to the lack of the corridors or the human impacts, the habitats are disturbed and ultimately lead to the reduction in the species or the species richness in the particular area. So you will find lots of studies and lots of databases are developed globally, and these can be studied from a local level to a large global level. So this is one example, the study conducted by the Crooks et al. Based on the availability of the interior core for a particular the group of the terrestrial mammals. So based on that, the fragmentation that index were developed. So here based on the core, you can see the fragmentation index over the Indian this region, and this is the based on the human footprints, the agriculture patterns, the roads, and the other that we create due to the human beings, different infrastructure. So based on that, you can see the disturbance index over the Indian parts. And this example is this is derived based on, because sometimes we have the natural barriers. If you remove the natural barriers, what are the actual disturbance based on the human footprints as well as the interior core. So this is the example for the Indian context. So you will find the most of the landscape in the India. You can see the small part in the northeastern region, or the Himalayan area, or the Western Ghats, or in the desert area, that are in the blue color, which means that landscape are more or less connected. So in the rest of the India, or the part, you can see the high fragmentation of the landscape. So this is the one parameter we can connect the diversity patterns of the species over the area. And this is the global patterns. Because of the huge data set that is available from the remote sensing, and also the integration of the various layers through the GIS, we can do the larger landscape or the regional or the global level study, and you can identify what are the important the hotspot of the fragmentation of the habitats. So based on the these the assessments, we can also relate the species, the patterns or the richness patterns with the patches. For example, in this example, you can see the number of patches with the habitat amount. Because if you have the more number of patches and more number of patches than in any area, then we have the more fragmented. You can see if the number of patches will be more in the same area, then the habitat will be more or less porous in kind of thing. Then the total amount, the amount of habitat will be less in case of the more number of patches in the any area. So in case of the mean patch size, if the patch size will be larger, the core will be larger, then the habitat amount of any species will be larger. Similarly, in case of the nearest neighbor or the total age or the size of the largest patch. So these are the positively correlated the largest patch with the habitat amount, and the number of patches will be negatively correlated with the total habitat amount of the species. So another derivation from this landscape or the fragmentation analysis will be the magnitude of the species loss with the fragmented area. So here you can see the distance from the age, shape, complexity, or the different the contrast, the matrix contrast. Based on these parameters, we can assess the magnitude of the species loss over a particular area. So this is also assessed at a larger or the global level, because the larger the global level study, they assessed the actual impact of the habitat fragmentation on the various conservation status of the mammals or the species. Here you can see if you see the low to high fragmentation area, and also the number of the endangered species. So you will find the endangered or the critically endangered species in the highly fragmented area, because the many species with very narrow distribution ranges or the high endemic the endemicity, they are basically located in a particular area, very small geographic area. So those kind of area are basically fragmented as compared to the species with the larger distribution or the distribution ranges. So this depicts the importance of the habitat fragmentation studies with respect to the biodiversity studies. So you can see the number of studies, the trend of the studies in the recent past, and these are the very growing very exponentially. So the fragmentation, habitat fragmentation, and the landscape level analysis, they are very important parameter in the biodiversity assessment in any area. So the important parameter is the vegetation type characterization, because many species or group of species, they are tend to adapt in a certain kind of environment, and the vegetation type, the individual vegetation type, they provide the important habitat for the particular species. So because we have the repeat coverage of the area and the synoptic coverage, so based on those data sets, we can easily characterize the vegetation of a particular area. In these two images, you can see the contrast in the vegetation cover. In the December month image, you will find all the area in the, if you see the FCC of any area, you will find the all area is represented by a similar kind of color, because this is the peak growing season after the monsoon. But if you see the same image or the same area in the dry period, where the many of the species, the deciduous species, they shed their leaves, then you will find a sharp contrast in the landscape. So in this case, this image will not that much suitable for the characterizing the vegetation types as compared to the images with the sharp contrast among the different vegetation type. So here you can see the different the vegetation type depicted in the image, because in the difference in the phenological patterns and the other characteristics of the vegetation, we can easily differentiate based on their spectral properties and also with the derived products. For example, the vegetation indices also. So in the January, April and May months, you can see the similar vegetation respond differently. So we can, based on these spectral separability among the different vegetation type, we can characterize the different species as well as the vegetation. So the time series or the multi-temporal data sets are also useful to characterize at the vegetation type level, because sometimes in one time imagery we cannot differentiate the two different vegetation type, and the characterizing the vegetation type are very important to link the diversity of a particular area and the link the diversity with the habitat of the species with respect to the vegetation. So this is the one simple the diagrammatic representation how we do the vegetation characterization, and based on, because the ground that sampling, that is very important aspect in this geoinformatics. So based on the ground data, and we can train the classifier or the algorithm, and we derive the products as a different vegetation types. So because these are the exercise were already done at the landscape, or the country-wide exercises were conducted in the recent past. So because that it depends on the area, what will be the scale of the output maps, because if you see in the countrywide scale, the 1:50,000 map scale will be good for characterizing or the prioritization of the area for the biodiversity conservation point of view, or the prioritization of the habitats or the area, the larger area for the conservation. But in the regional or the local level data, we need more finer the 1:10,000 or 1:5,000 scale, in which we can develop the local level conservation plans at the village or the watershed levels. And this is all possible through the remote sensing and the GIS also. So here is the example of the two different levels of the classification. One is the physiognomic level, which we clump the different kind of vegetation or the group of the species based on their characteristics. For example, the broadleaf or the conifer species or the deciduous species. But if you see, there will be many species which can be differentiated from the deciduous also, and there will be multiple species in the deciduous classes or the conifer classes. So the species level data is very important for conservation point of view or the biodiversity point of view, because many species they are adapted for a particular climatic conditions, and many birds or the group of the mammals which are basically the certain kind of species level that the maps or the classes, they are more important to relate the habitat of a particular group of species over the area. So another the parameter is the delineation of the indicator species or a particular the gregarious formation over a particular area, because these are the indicator species are very important because they contribute largely to the biodiversity of any area in terms of the coverage or the biomass, and any species, if it contributes as a larger proportion, we consider that as an indicator of a particular habitat or the climate. So in this case, we can see that we can easily delineate the oak forest distribution in the Uttarakhand state, because this a particular species is considered very important ecologically as well as have very high socio-economic importance. So we can delineate these gregarious or the indicator species, and these are very important. This particular forest is very important source for the different bioresources that we derive from a forest. So another here in this image you can see the pine forest, because the most of the forest fire that is associated in this the foothills of the Himalayan area, that is associated with the distribution of the pine forest. So the distribution of if you know the distribution of the pine or the gregarious oak forest, then we can do the management to mitigate the various those events which occur due to the anthropogenic activities or the other functions that contribute to the distribution as well as the other the biodiversity values to a particular area. So this is one of the model that is based on the earlier study that is conducted in the Indian Institute of Remote Sensing. So this is the based on the spatial landscape modeling that is SPLAM, and here you can see how the various the parameters that discussed that are linked from the ground level, that database that we collected during the inventory, and from what we can derive from all those parameters in different scales. So in this case we can see the species uniqueness or the endemism from the ground data, and based on the importance value how the species contribute to a particular forest, we can derive the what are the dominant species, the biodiversity value of those area, and the species richness and diversity indices. So basic things that we derive from a ground data or the inventory data that is included here, and it contributes ultimately to see the richness patterns of a landscape. So another that parameter is the biological parameter that categorized here, and based on the ground inventory we can classify the broad patterns of the vegetation in terms of the cover classes as well as the different vegetation type classes. So from the vegetation cover we can analyze the patterns of fragmentation and the proximity. Also, if you add the social aspect, the human disturbances, also human patterns in the landscape, and based on these all parameters, the broad the vegetation types, the cover and the fragmentation analysis, the disturbance index was derived, which is basically based on the fragmentation, porosity, interspection, and the human dispersion, the disturbance on that landscape. So based on all these parameters, the disturbance index were derived, and to integrate the physical parameters and the terrain complexity, how the slope, aspect, elevation, all these parameters are distributed over the area, and the ecosystem uniqueness based on the endemism and endemicity of the species and the unique value over the landscape, we derive the biological richness of a particular area. So that is basically a function of the ecosystem uniqueness, species richness, and the terrain complexity, as well as the inclusion of the human part on a particular area. So based on all those parameters, we can assess the richness patterns or the biological richness value of a particular area. So these are the outputs of this landscape level study on the biodiversity assessment conducted. So this is the fragmentation map based on the distribution of the patches or the in a particular area. So low, it is characterized as a low, medium and high fragmentation area. And the another product is the disturbance index, how the human intervention or the habitat fragmentation is there. This is another parameter. This is the biological richness map as discussed earlier. Based on all the values, this is derived, and you can see the higher the biological richness value in the low disturbed area or the high forest cover area, you can see in the Western Ghat, Central India, Northeast, as well as in the Himalayan area. So this is the vegetation type map that is derived, and large number of vegetation types were characterized and mapped for the country level. So this information is also available in this in the website of the bis.irs.gov.in, and also on request this we provide to the users. So this is the one of the important the aspect of biodiversity assessment of the, at landscape level. The another component or the parameter we will discuss, that is the distribution of assessment of the rare species, because the rare species in case of rare species we have very low the distribution data, or the their distribution points are very rare and also have very few the historical records. So based on the species distribution model that is already discussed in a class, we can predict the most suitable habitats or the area of the distribution of a particular species. So this is the one example of one of the medicinally important species in the Himalayan region. So based on this area, this analysis, we can assess which area are highly suitable, less suitable and not suitable for the area. And this analysis also gives the stratification base for the sampling point of view in the field studies. So also we can see here at a regional or the larger landscape level what will be the suitability of the habitat for a particular species, and this red area denotes the highly suitable area, and the blue or light blue color depicts the less suitable area. So our focus will be the sampling focus will be more on the highly suitable area, because there will be more chances of the occurrences of such rare species in a landscape. And such exercise also forms a baseline for the analysis, the hotspot for the rare species, because if some area are highly suitable, and based on that we can do the field based the surveys, and we can also categorize the different zones as per the density of the area based on the field study. So the another example, that parameter that we derive through the remote sensing and GIS is the functional type level maps. So functional types basically are the grouping of the species based on the similar characteristics, the functional characteristic of a landscape. So in this particular study that is conducted in the Western Himalayan region, and based on the field data, the different the functional types were mapped and the predicted over a landscape. So because with the availability of the multispectral data sets, we can see the spectral separability of the different functional types. For example, here you can see the separability of the species or of the group of the functional types, Denthonia, dry scrubs, herbaceous, different these groups on a Landsat data. So this spectral separability is very important to characterize these the fine level the vegetation groups or the functional types, and based on these the information we can predict and model the distribution of different fine level vegetation types across the landscape. Not only the distribution, but we can also derive the different environmental the proxies of the environmental parameters from the remote sensing. For example, the solar radiation, snow days, land surface temperature, or the hillside, slope, aspect, and elevation. All those parameters we can derive through the remote sensing and GIS tools, and we can see the correlation of the species richness that is derived through the ground data or the sampling data, and we can correlate how the different environmental or the biotic and abiotic parameters are linked with the species richness in a particular area. So this helps in the modeling of the species richness patterns over a larger landscape. So in this case we can see the low species richness in the interior valley. Basically the interior parts are the inner valleys of the Himalaya, the trans-Himalayan region, or the cold arid regions, and the species richness is very low in that area. So in the lower area or the greater Himalayan or the moister area, you will see the high species richness because in the area or the landscape which are less accessible and we have very few sampling points, we can predict the species richness patterns with the help of the environmental proxies that we derive from the remote sensing data. So the another that example I will discuss the species level mapping with the very high resolution satellite data, because in the recent years we have the progress towards the availability of the very high resolution data that is less than 1 kilometer spatial resolution. And here is the list of some of the data sets. That is the Cartoset, that is the Indian data with 1.6 meter multispectral data that we have, the WorldView 2, GeoEye, QuickBirds. There are so many data sets which are available globally, and they are very important, as I earlier discussed, in the canopy or the population level study of a particular species. So this is one example that we are familiar with. This is the Forest Research Institute, that campus area. This is the Google Earth image of that particular area, and here you can see the different buildings and also the forest type that you can see based on the contrast in the color. So this is the our Cartoset 2S data, and here you can see also the contrast in the true color composite, and this is the false color composite of the same area. This is the pen sharpened image, the fusion of the multispectral with the pen chromatic image, and here you can clearly see different the patterns or the contrast among the vegetation. This is the pine forest, or because we know this area, so we can identify different group of the forest or the species in the particular area. But in the case study that I am discussing here, the interest was this particular triangle, and because this the very high satellite resolution data is very important, and we can derive the canopy level data for a particular species, and due to the spectral characteristic of a particular species, we can differentiate between different species also, and we can count the number of the particular canopy of a particular species in an area. So the segmentation, the image segmentation is the one of the method based on which we can derive the segmented image or the segmentation of the group or the canopy of a particular species, and we can classify, and based on the crown projection area, how much the crown the characteristic of a particular species, we can derive the number of the individuals over the area, as well as the distribution of the population of a particular species in a particular area. But the field data or the ground truth points are very important in this case. So here we can see this is the triangle, and so the yellow color, these circles are based on the ground validation that denoted here, and this is the image, the segmented image based on the recognition. So here you can see the contrast as well as the different canopy structure or the segmented image. This is because this is the multi-resolution segmentation, and it groups the different the canopy characteristics in a different size of these segmented classes. So based on the ground truth, you can identify what the canopy, the segmented class is the correspond to a particular species, and we can derive a species distribution level, species distribution map of a particular area. So here you can see the almost more than 15 different species of trees were identified, as well as their number of individuals or the canopies were classified a particular area. So based on this high resolution data, we can do the canopy level assessment, and also we can assess the population structure of a particular area. So the one example we will discuss about the machine learning, because this is the very important and the emerging tool in the recent years, and this is the one of the application of the artificial intelligence, and it actually provides the system the ability to automatically learn and improve from the experience. So once you feed the data on this that model or the system, it automatically calculates and learns from the analysis. So machine learning basically focuses on the development of the computer programs that can assess data and use it to learn for themselves. So there are various programming techniques which can handle large amount of data, because the availability of the very large data sets, the remote sensing data sets. So these are very important tools which can be useful for the handle the high dimensionality of the data and the large data sets. So basically we can divide the machine learning tools into three basic types: the supervised, unsupervised, and the reinforcement learning. So supervised, basically that is the task driven. We train the model, and based on that training data sets, it works on the entire data sets and it derives the products. So the unsupervised learning is basically it clusters the data sets into the different the clusters based on the distribution of the data. So basically these two are very important in the remote sensing perspective, and the other one is that is very important in the basically in the robotics or the other the deep learning that applications and we use. So this is one example of the application of the machine learning. So here we can see the utility of the machine learning tool. It automatically identify the bird species and also the count of the number in the real time phenomena. So this is one example where the machine learning is important. So another the interesting aspect is the image based species the identification or the recognition, and there are lots of application are developed or being developed for the identification of the plant species especially, or the other the butterflies or the other group of species. So here the machine learning tools are important, because what we see as a taxonomy in a flower part, that the machine learning, that application, it takes as a vector data. So based on the patterns, the edges of the particular petal or the texture, their contours, it identify the flowers of a particular species or the character of a particular species. So based on these, it basically these all the taxonomic character which we see, it acts as a feature vectors for the training of a model. So these acts as a feature vectors, and if we are using a or feeding a new image in a particular application or a model, based on these feature vectors, it identify it, or it goes near to that particular species. So this is one of the emerging application of machine learning in the field of this biodiversity or especially in the plant ecology. So the another example is the delineation of the vegetation community based on the machine learning tool that we used a case study in the Himalayan region using the random forest, which is a supervised learning algorithm, and it creates the decision tree, and also it develops the multiple or decision tree, and on the basis of the voting, it reaches up to a decision. So which class will belong, or the which of the decision tree will belong to a particular set of that the training set we provided to that. So in a simple example, we can see here a simple decision tree. So based on the color, the groups in the two different groups. And if you see the further the refined characters, for example, the underline the characters, it will break the tree into further the underline and the which are not underlined. So this is the one example of the simple decision tree. But in the real life or in the natural ecosystem, this simple things does not exist. So there are multiple parameters and multiple the data sets we available. So random forest develops multiple decision trees, and on the basis of the boards of these decision trees, it derives or it denotes a particular class. So this we applied in a high altitude area of the Himalayan region because in the high altitude landscapes, the vegetation are, especially the alpine vegetations, are distributed in very intermixing patterns, and to classify these vegetation into the community level or the further finer level, it is very challenging with the simple classification methods. So this is the one of the example. These are the different data sets, and we used in the Sentinel data. So these are different data sets for the different communities. For example, the tree classes or the shrub, and many herbaceous training data sets are there for the herbaceous communities. So because the Sentinel is a multispectral that satellite data, so we can see the spectral separability among the vegetation classes also in this case. So this is the output of those the random forest based classification of this alpine ecosystem. So here you can see the distribution of the scree, the Danthonia forest, juniperus, scrub, cobrecia, and different kind of other alpine vegetation in a particular area, because this is very fine level the classification, and the machine learning, especially random forest or the support vector machine, these are very useful to classify the vegetation in a very finer scale. So another that parameter is the wildlife habitat suitability analysis, that is linked to the biodiversity assessment of a particular area. So this is a multi-criteria analysis. So based on the the environmental factors, because a particular wildlife species, it depends, its habitat or its distribution depends on the multiple factors. So the one of the most important will be the vegetation type, the cover, the land use, and the elevation, slope, aspect, various the topographical factors, and also the impacts of the human beings. What are the disturbance factors are there, and in case of carnivore we also include the prey density. What is the number of prey there, and the dependence variable in this case will be the ground truth point for the distribution of a particular species. So because this is a based on the multiple criteria, so a regression equation is developed based on the weightage given to a particular the variable. So based on the regression, we can assess the what will be the highly suitable habitat for a particular species, the moderately suitable or the least suitable area for the distribution of a particular species. This is important in biodiversity studies, because if you know the highly suitable area for a particular species, then we can do the conservation that exercises for a particular species or the management for the conservation of a species. So one example, and that the last example will be the wildlife suitability at a larger landscape, because the ecosystems or the habitats are connected over a larger area. So if you see the example of the Tarai Arc landscape, it all goes from the foothills of the Himachal Pradesh or Jammu Kashmir up to the northeastern parts of the India. So considering the distribution of large mammals, especially in the tiger one, the study was conducted, and here you can see the distribution of protected area in this area, and the important corridors that for the movement of the species, and the different landscape matrices. So based on the fragmentation analysis or the distribution of the suitable habitat patches, this analysis was done. So what will be the suitable or the dispersal potential of this area in a particular area? So as I earlier mentioned, the Rajaji Corbett landscape, so this part shows the very less suitable the dispersal potential of area for the dispersion of the tiger. Because here you can see this between the Rajaji National Park and the tiger, the large area is under the human intervention or the various developmental activities. So in a larger landscape, for the conservation or the assessment of the biodiversity of a larger landscape, so these all the parameters, the starting from the forest cover, vegetation type, or the fragmentation analysis, landscape matrix, all those parameters actually contribute to the assessment of biodiversity or the conservation prioritization of a landscape. So this is one example, because forest fire is important aspect of the landscape. In the recent year, we have seen in a larger part of the global how this is affecting the biodiversity, and how the forest fire events have impact on the forest cover and the species distributed there. So there are various remote sensing sensors basis of which we can detect the active fire locations, and this is a regular exercise of forest department. Based on the satellite data, we give the message to the local level authority, so that immediately we can do the prevention measures so that the fire can be controllable. So this is another use, because the fire events are very drastic to the biodiversity. They destroy the habitats and the species distributed there, and based on the various remote sensing sensors, we can actually assess, or we can predict, or we can assess the impact of the and the fire events on a particular area. So all these activity ultimately links to the biodiversity prioritization based on all those parameters, the remote sensing parameters, the GIS tools, and the ground sampling. We can assess the habitat and the biodiversity of a particular area and prioritize, because ultimately this useful for the prioritization of a habitat for the conservation and the protection of biodiversity of the area. So concluding, the geoinformatics is a very efficient tool in the biodiversity studies, and the time series data that is available over the period of time is very useful to see the changes in the patterns of diversity, and the prediction and the modeling is very possible through the geoinformatics tools. And the future perspective includes the precision forestry, basically the use of very high resolution data, the UAV remote sensing, LiDAR, or the hyperspectral sensor, based on which we can assess the health of a particular ecosystem. And the advanced machine learning tools are very promising, so we can assess the biodiversity of a larger area with larger data sets. So with this, I thank all